I have been trained to spot danger in a second, to read breathing rhythms and foot placements and shifts in tone that reveal intent before a word leaves someone's mouth. None of that prepared me for the sight of my daughter standing barefoot in the snow while my stepfather held the back door shut. The wind howled like it was trying to warn me. It was late December in Fort Drum, New York, a winter night where the cold cuts through bone and history, the kind of cold soldiers curse on ruck marches and mothers fear when their kids catch a chill. 8 degrees, snow thick like smothering feathers falling from a merciless sky. I had convinced myself this visit would be different, a chance to stitch years of family strain back together, a fragile holiday truce. My mother had welcomed me with that brittle smile she always used for guests she wanted to impress, which meant me. My daughter Emmy stayed glued to my side, her hands clutching my coat sleeve like she could anchor herself to safety. She does not speak. She has not spoken since she was 4. Trauma does that. It teaches silence the way others teach lullabies. Emmy communicates through signs or riding a quiet fighter with eyes that never lie. We sat in my mother's living room, hot chocolate steaming, a Christmas candle flickering with that warm cinnamon glow manufactured to mimic comfort. Gerald Kane, my stepfather, paced like he owned the air in the room and we were trespassers borrowing it. He has always been a man who loves control more than peace authority, more than kindness and obedience, more than love. Growing up under him felt like sleeping beside a loaded firearm you were forbidden to touch, yet blamed for every bullet missing. Emmy's hand shook as she lifted her mug and it slipped. The sound of ceramic striking hardwood felt like a gunshot in a silent barracks. The cocoa splattered across the rug. Emmy froze, her small chest rising fast, eyes wide, no voice to say sorry. Gerald's face hardened into that smug expression that used to make my stomach twist when I was a child. He did not yell. Men like him do not need volume. They rely on domination as casually as breathing. Kids like her need discipline, not pity. My mother flinched but said nothing. Of course she did nothing. That was always her greatest loyalty, silence, not love. I stood to move toward Emmy, but Gerald cut in front of me, hand on my shoulder, like he was still entitled to direct me to claim parental authority over a grown woman who once carried a weapon and enforced military law. My house. My rules. He said it softly, almost polite, and that made it worse. Then he opened the back door. I remember the sound first, the immediate screaming roar of winter bursting in and swallowing the room. Before I could speak, before I could react, he put his hand on Emmy's shoulder. She flinched, but she did not fight. She never fights. Trauma teaches compliance first. He pushed her gently but firmly into the night. Bare feet, thin leggings, a sweater and no coat. Snow swallowed her ankles. She stumbled, arms hugging herself, breath turning to frost in the dark. The door slammed. A lock clicked. I will never forget the silence after. My daughter, mute by trauma, left outside in weather that could stop a grown soldier's heart if left long enough. I could hear my pulse in my ears like combat noise. My training surged instinct overriding shock. I moved toward the door, but Gerald stepped in my path. She'll learn obedience out there. His voice was calm, casual, like he was teaching a dog to heel, not pushing a child into lethal cold. Open the door. He smirked. Soft mothers raise broken children. I stared at him, and in that second I was no longer his stepdaughter trying to be civil for the holidays. I was a former military police officer assessing a threat. The living room lights cast just enough glow through the glass for me to see Emmy on the porch, tiny body-shaking snow gathering in her dark curls. She lifted one trembling hand and touched the glass. No sound, just breath fogging a circle. Then she used her finger to write on the frosty pane. One word. Mom. My heart cracked, not loudly, quiet like ice splitting under too much weight. I reached for the door again, and this time Gerald did not get to finish whatever threat he thought he owned. I shoved him aside, muscle memory from years of room entries firing through me. I did not yell. Rage does not always roar. Sometimes it is ice, slow, controlled, devastating. I opened the door and cold hit like a shock grenade. Emmy collapsed into my arms, skin like frozen porcelain body, weightless with fear. My voice shook only once when I said, "Touch her again and the law walks through this door, not me." He laughed. That laugh will stay in my bones longer than any winter. If someone did that to your child, tell me what you would do. You would burn the world too. Right, I know I would. When I was 8, I learned that silence was not peace. It was survival. My mother loved appearances more than warmth, reputation, more than connection, and the idea of family far more than the practice of it. She ironed lies the way other mothers ironed shirts. Growing up in that house meant understanding early that love came with conditions and obedience was praised more than honesty. Gerald entered my life when I was 9, and from the moment he shook my hand, I understood fear in a new language. He never raised his voice, and somehow that made everything worse. He did not have to shout. Control was his fluent tongue. He enforced rules with an edge that brushed the line between discipline and domination, the kind that made you sit straighter, breathe quieter, walk lighter. It was not immediate, the change in me. It was gradual, like frost spreading across glass. I learned to read moods like maps and measure the weight of footsteps in the hallway. If a voice sounded tight, I shrank. If a door clicked a certain way, I vanished into stillness. When I turned 17, I packed a bag and left without looking back. The military was not an escape at first. It was a challenge I chose so that no one could ever corner me again. My drill sergeant barked orders that felt honest compared to the quiet control I grew up with. At least in the Army, the rules had purpose. You could earn respect. You could build yourself again. I did. I became military police. I studied regulations the way other recruits studied weapons. I learned that power can protect, not only punish. That structure can heal what chaos destroys. That discipline can be strength and not cruelty. It shocked me how much I excelled. Maybe I had been preparing for that training long before I knew what it meant. Gerald taught me fear, but the Army taught me how to turn fear into clarity. Still, there was a part of me that wanted softness. I met Emmy's father during field training in Oklahoma. He had steady eyes, a quiet voice, and the kind of confidence that felt safe. He laughed softly, not to dominate space, but to share it. I trusted him. I believed in him. That belief lasted until 2 months after Emmy was born. Some fathers drift away slowly. He vanished overnight. No note, no steady voice to soothe the silence he left. Duty, he said the one time he called. Too much responsibility, he admitted on the second. Then nothing. I looked down at Emmy in my arms, and I promised her my voice would never disappear. When Emmy turned 4, silence returned in a cruel way. It was a warm spring morning. She had been outside playing with chalk on the sidewalk, drawing big shapes with tiny hands. I left the room for a moment. When I returned, I found her frozen in place, chalk dust smeared across her palms, eyes wide and lost breath shallow. Her body fine. Her spirit shaken like a window in a storm. I never got the full story. Trauma rarely gives explanations. It only leaves echoes. The doctors told me it was trauma response silence, not physical. They told me the voice might return or it might not. They told me patience was medicine and love was therapy. I learned sign language right away. I taught her to write words in notebooks. I sat with her every night, speaking softly about the world, knowing she heard everything, even if she did not answer. We built a new language together, quiet but powerful. She touches my hand when she needs comfort. She writes one-word messages in careful letters. She lifts her chin when she refuses to surrender. I see myself in her, and I fear for her the way no one ever feared for me. When I chose to visit my mother again this winter, I convinced myself it was time to close wounds. That forgiveness might finally be possible. That maybe growing older had softened Gerald the way time softens sharp stone in a river. I was wrong. Trauma has a memory longer than hope. I stared at that frozen porch hours ago, my daughter shaking in the winter dark, and a thought burned inside me with a clarity sharper than cold. Why did I come back here? Was it duty, nostalgia, desperation for a mother I never truly had? Or was it because part of me still believed I owed something to this house? That trauma was a debt instead of a scar. I pressed my cheek to Emmy's hair once we were safe in the car and whispered to her even though she could not speak back. We do not owe anyone who harms us. We do not return to cages just because we grew up in them. And inside my chest, another question echoed. Did I come back out of hope or out of guilt? Did I still think I needed to prove something? If so, to who and why? The morning after the snow incident, the house woke up as if nothing had happened, like winter itself had imagined the cruelty. My mother moved through the kitchen humming an old radio tune, the kind that fills silences instead of soothing them. She set the table with her good china arranging napkins and silverware, as though preparing for company instead of two shaken people trying to steady their breathing. The fireplace glowed warm cinnamon rolls baked in the oven, and if a stranger walked in, they would think this was a postcard family holiday in upstate New York. But trauma has its own scent, faint, but impossible to ignore once you know it. Emmy sat beside me at the table, hands in her lap, shoulders slightly lifted the way they do when she braces herself. She did not eat, just stared at the cinnamon roll on her plate, fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve like she needed the touch to stay anchored. Gerald poured coffee like a man hosting a business brunch, not someone who had put a child outside in deadly cold hours earlier. He sat across from us with a newspaper folded on the table, hand-steepled eyes scanning us without looking. A child must stand to show effort before she earns the privilege of sitting, he said like he was reading a weather report. That is how strong character is built. For a second, I thought I misheard. I had hoped maybe stupidly that shame would have seeped into him overnight. That decency might have tapped him on the shoulder. But there he was, speaking with that calm certainty that always masked something darker. My fork paused midair. She is 8, I replied, low and steady tone, controlled like I was back in uniform addressing someone who thought rank made them right. He smiled a thin stretch of lips without warmth. Children who wish to be accepted learn to earn things. Sitting is not automatic. The room tilted a little, not physically, but morally. I felt the old weight of childhood creep up my spine, the familiar pressure telling me to fold to keep peace, to avoid setting off the person who believes control is care. My mother placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, performative softness voice, trembling with false concern. He only wants to help her be strong. There it was, gaslighting like a family recipe handed down. My mother could take cruelty, wrap it in lace, and present it as guidance. She could watch harm and still call it love. I looked at her hand, then up at her face. Strength is not learned through fear, I said. She blinked as if surprised I dared answer. Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly, not angered, but disappointed the way a commander might look at a soldier refusing to follow an unjust order. Emmy tugged on my sleeve, then her notebook already open, pencil tapping. She wrote only 2 words. We go. My throat clenched. I put my arm around her, and for a moment, we sat like that mother and daughter, silently deciding something that would shift everything. We would not stay. That certainty settled in my bones. Still, I had to be careful. Abusers do not like sudden exits. They like compliance ritual, the quiet surrender they earned over time. Leaving too quickly can spark the worst in them. I forced myself to take a bite of breakfast, to breathe slow, to move through that morning like someone who had not been broken open the night before. Gerald continued to talk about discipline and structure, as if the military he never served in appointed him guardian of character. Softness ruins children, he said, sipping coffee. Weak mothers raise weak daughters. I thought about the army, the drill sergeant who screamed at us until his voice cracked, the medic who held a trainee during a panic attack and whispered instructions until her breathing steadied. Only one of them represented real strength, and it was not the man who yelled. Kindness is not weakness. It is strategy. It saves lives. It saved mine. When breakfast ended, my mother insisted on bundling us in scarves for a walk through the snowy neighborhood. A family stroll, she called it, voice too bright, too eager. She wanted to reset the narrative to coat last night in frosting, like she did Christmas cookies covering cracks with sugar. Fresh air will help her, she murmured, nodding at Emmy. But Emmy clung to me like she might vanish if she let go. We walked down the street, snow crunching under boots, the air sharp and thin. Houses stood quiet under heavy white blankets, wreaths on doors, holiday lights still up. A gentle scene, the kind people imagine when they think of small northern towns. Then a door creaked open 2 houses down, and a woman in a thick coat stepped out with a shovel. She looked up and paused when she saw us, her brows knit with concern. "Morning," she called, voice warm. She looked at Emmy, then at me. "You staying long?" Her tone was friendly on the surface, but her eyes carried something else. Knowledge, caution, worry. Before I could answer, she added softer, "I hope she's okay this time." My heart stopped for a beat. Time seemed to freeze more than the air already had. This time. The world tightened around that phrase like a vice. The woman smiled sadly and kept shoveling, but I stood rooted. I turned to my mother, whose face flushed with defensive heat. "She means nothing by that," she snapped too quickly. Gerald kept walking, not slowing, not acknowledging. He did not need to. That reaction was the answer. Emmy squeezed my hand, small fingers trembling in her gloves. I stared at that quiet street, at Christmas decorations meant to symbolize peace, and realized peace had never lived in that house. Not for me, not for Emmy. The snow crunched again as I took a breath that hurt to inhale. This was not a single moment of cruelty. It was a pattern woven through years, repeating, looping like barbed wire around the heart of this family. I had walked into a cycle thinking time healed things that time had only hidden. This was not an accident. This was a system, a ritual. And standing there in the bitter cold, I whispered inside my mind, clear and sharp as steel, "This cycle ends with me." That afternoon, the house felt smaller, like the walls were inching inward with every passing hour. The holiday decorations that once seemed festive now felt like props in a staged performance, bright colors smothering darker truths. Emmy sat close to me on the couch, drawing soft circles on my sleeve, with her fingertip, a habit she has when anxiety rises under her skin. My mother lit a candle that smelled like pine and sugar, a forced sweetness that only made the air heavier. Gerald entered the room with slow, deliberate steps, as if he were walking into a briefing he commanded. His footsteps always had weight, not in sound, but in presence. "Let me hold your phone," he said, extending his hand with casual authority. Not a question, not even a request. A command dressed in politeness. "We do not need distractions in this house. We focus on family here." I studied his face. Calm, controlled, practiced. "I keep my phone." I replied, matching his tone, neutral, steady. A soldier talking to someone who thought they outranked her. His fingers twitched, once barely visible irritation slipping through his mask. "Control denied is danger ignited in people like him. Rules help keep order. You know that," he said slowly, as if explaining a principle to a child. "Hand it over." My mother entered with a notepad and a neat pen, as though preparing for a domestic mission briefing. She sat beside Gerald, her posture perfect, her smile brittle. "We do things a certain way here, Raina. It keeps peace." She slid the notepad toward me like a hostess offering dessert. Written in tidy handwriting. "No arguing with Gerald. Children obey elders. No outside interference." My eyes skimmed the list, each line tightening my chest. This was not guidance. It was doctrine, not tradition, command. And suddenly, my childhood rearranged itself in my mind like puzzle pieces snapping into place. Not chaos, design. Not accidental harm. Structure, the rules were never about order. They were about dominance. "You want me to sign this?" I asked quietly. My mother lifted her chin, false gentleness sharpening into expectation. "We all follow the same principles under this roof." Gerald leaned forward. "A household without rules falls apart. You should understand structure with your background." He emphasized background like a subtle reminder that my time in uniform ended, as if leaving active duty meant forfeiting strength. Emmy pressed her knee against mine. I could feel her tremble through layers of winter clothing. Her notebook was open on her lap, pencil trembling in her small hand. She wrote slowly, deliberately. "We leave soon." I moved my hand to cover hers briefly, just enough for her to feel I heard her. I did not smile. Smiling would have broken me. Gerald noticed the motion, his jaw tightening. "Children learn resilience when parents are firm. Comfort creates weakness." He spoke like someone lecturing about storms while never standing in one. I inhaled steady, but inside a wire stretched tight. Comfort creates safety, I answered softly. His eyes narrowed. Safety creates dependence. I looked at Emmy, at her hands, at the notebook where she now drew a shaking line under the previous sentence. Then she wrote again. He hit me before. The pencil stroke wobbled as she finished the E. My heart turned to ice and fire all at once. I lifted my gaze slowly. When? My voice was barely a sound controlled so tightly it threatened to snap. Emmy swallowed and tapped the notebook again, then pressed her fingers to her cheek, a gesture that looked like a memory her body had not forgotten. My mother shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting. Children misinterpret things. She probably bumped into something. The denial was instant reflexive, polished by years of practice. We do not accuse family here, she added, trying to stitch a calm expression over fear. Accusation tears blood apart. My breath left me in one slow exhale. She was not shocked by the claim. She was not defending from disbelief. She was defending from exposure. Gerald, unaffected by the revelation, simply folded his hands. Pain teaches lessons, Raina. You know that. The world does not coddle the weak. Pain breaks children, I replied, voice low. Discipline builds character, he answered. Discipline protects them from the harshness outside. My skin prickled. Discipline does not mean harm. That depends on the person's threshold, he said, tone smooth, as though debating philosophy, not a child's safety. The fireplace crackled, and for a second I heard nothing but the steady beat of my pulse counting down to something inevitable. The corners of the room seemed too sharp suddenly, the air too thick. Then I saw it. A reflection in the glass of a framed picture, a small camera tucked into the corner of the bookshelf. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew how to scan a room, a habit drilled into me by training and survival. I followed the angle with my eyes and spotted another one half hidden near a vent, barely more than a dark speck. The house was watching, recording, not to protect, to monitor, to enforce. Patterns, systems, rituals. My chest tightened like a vest cinched too hard. This was not a moment. It was a pattern of power repeated through years, and I had brought my daughter into it. Rage did not shout in me. It settled like a soldier laying down a plan. Quiet, precise, certain. I am not signing your rules, I said, voice steady as ice. My mother inhaled sharply. Gerald did not move. His stillness was threat, not calm. You will not undermine my household, he replied. I lifted Emmy into my lap. She rested her head against my shoulder, exhausted from fear she could not voice. I wrapped my arm around her, anchoring her to safety. Your household does not rule my child, I said. His expression flickered. A crack. Small, but real. Then he smiled. You think you have a choice, he said quietly. I held Emmy tighter. I know I do. In his eyes, I saw something dangerous click into place, a decision forming like ice on a window pane, a choice to escalate. But he did not speak. He did not need to. The battle line had just been drawn invisible but undeniable. And for the first time since I walked into that house, I understood something simple and horrifying. This place was not trying to heal anything. It was trying to own us. The next night, the blizzard came with a cruelty that felt deliberate wind shredding the dark and driving snow in sheets that turned the porch into a drift. Fort Drum winters are honest about danger, and they do not offer gentle warnings. I had checked the forecasts earlier, and I knew the roads would turn to glass and the temperature would bite. But I stayed because I had promised Emmy we would try for a normal holiday, and sometimes promises are louder than prudence. Dinner had been brittle, the conversation polite, but taut like wire. Everyone performing calm, while the air hummed with tension after coffee and the brief attempt at small talk. Gerald rose as if rehearsing a line he had practiced for years and said, with that casual authority I had learned to distrust, that he wanted no distractions in his home. He reached for my phone from across the table as if it were a prop. He had been taught to collect an object that represented autonomy and therefore threatened his ordered world. I kept my hand on this device and watched him matching his tone with the steady, neutral voice that had kept me alive in worse places. "No distractions," he said, a statement served as a truth. My mother slid the old list of rules across the table with a pen poised like a ceremonial offer. No arguing with Gerald. Children obey elders, no outside interference. The lines were tidy and lethal. They read like doctrine, not suggestion, and I felt the old pattern settle around my chest. A cold armor I recognized from childhood. Emmy sat beside me with her notebook on her knees, pencil tapping those eyes. She has wide and honest, and she wrote a line that made the room tilt. "We go." I covered her hand with mine and held it there because some promises are kept with touch rather than words. Gerald smiled in the way men like him smile when they sense the leash tightening and said again that children learn resilience from firmness and that softness breeds dependence. These are phrases repeated in homes where control is mistaken for care. My mother nodded as if comfort and cruelty were the same cloth. The wind outside rose and the house seemed to draw closer around us like a net. Later, he asked for the phone again, and his polite voice carried an edge that made clear he viewed my autonomy as a breach that required correction. I placed the device on the table, and he closed his fingers over it as if securing a claim. I stood to take it back, and he said in a tone almost pleasant that he would hold it because distraction was a luxury this family could not afford. I said nothing then and watched the tiny cues my training taught me to read the way a thumb flexes before a strike, the subtle shift in weight when someone prepares to dominate a space. Emmy watched us with those hollow, honest eyes and wrote again with that small hand, the letters shaking. He hit me before the sentence landed like a stone. The pencil stroke jagged at the end as if the memory had rattled her. My mother blinked as if surprised and then smoothed her expression into practiced denial. Children misinterpret things she said, and Gerald folded his hands and spoke of discipline and preparation as though speaking of weather, as if pain could be framed as a lesson. I felt the precise calm of someone who knew public scenes would feed an abuser cover, and so I cataloged. Instead of yelling, my training clicked into place, and I scanned the room, my eyes catching the tiny pinprick of a camera tucked in the corner of a bookshelf and another half hidden behind a plant. The house was watching not to protect, but to collect evidence of obedience and shame to be used like currency. It all fit into a design I had been blind to by hope and nostalgia. Not accidental cruelty, but an architecture of control. I wrapped my arms around Emmy and felt the tremor of the words she'd written, and I whispered, "Steady as a command. I see you, and I will not let that be the end of your story." Gerald made a sound that was part chuckle and part snarl, and said that mothers who coddle will raise children who crumble his contempt was a practiced habit of someone who had never been held accountable. I moved then with the economy of motion that keeps people alive, not dramatic but efficient, measuring every reaction for escalation. The storm outside thrashed like a beast, and the room held a silence that felt like the pause before violence. I thought of the cold and how quickly exposure can become lethal for a small child in a blizzard. How a night left on the porch is an injury that can last a lifetime without drama. I tapped a message to the one friend who would move without question. "Come." Now Emmy pressed her forehead to my arm and wrote one more line before sliding the notebook closed. "I trust you." Gerald rose then with a slow calm that made my skin prickle and opened the back door. The wind hurled itself into the house, and he reached out and pushed Emmy toward the steps. She stumbled, but did not cry, folding into herself as the cold took hold, her breath a thin, white thread. The door clicked, and a lock turned like a verdict. I surged forward and shouldered past him, pried the lock, and scooped Emmy into my arms. Her skin was ice, and she did not wail. She was quiet, and that silence tore me deeper than any scream Gerald barked at me. Soft mothers raise broken children. His voice flat and rehearsed. I held my daughter and met his eyes and said low, so the cameras could not make a show of it, "Touch her again, and I will bring the law to your doorstep." He laughed a thin laugh that did not reach his eyes, and if anyone else in the house had the courage to look, they hid it behind a practiced mask of normality. I backed toward the car with Emmy pressed to my chest, the engine a small, warm promise in the snow. I texted again to the friend en route and to the attorney. I trusted to move without mercy in the whirling white. I thought of what I would do next, and my mind answered as simply as the oath I had taken when I swore to protect. If someone did this to your child, you'd burn the world too. Right. I drove away while the house disappeared behind a curtain of falling snow tires whispering over a road slick with ice, and the world shrank to the small parcel of warmth cradling my daughter in the passenger seat. I did not stop to argue or to let anger bleed into theatrics that was not useful, and anger for its own sake is a luxury I had learned to ration. So I drove until neon motel signs bled into the windshield and the heater hummed a quiet promise of temporary safety. The room smelled like bleach and cheap coffee, functional and forgettable, which was exactly what I needed while I moved like a small unit executing a containment operation. I bundled Emmy in a spare blanket, set her on the bed with a notebook and pencil, and while she traced letters with slow, careful strokes, I took inventory in my head like I used to before a mission. First, evidence. Second, witnesses. Third, legal levers. I texted Sergeant David Cole with a single word and a location, come. His reply was instant 2 words, on my way. David and I had slid over the same obstacles in military life, and when you need someone who understands both procedure and force without drama, you call the ones who have seen the worst and kept their hands clean. Then I called Melissa Green, the domestic violence attorney I had met at a veterans support event 2 years earlier. She had a reputation for unflinching precision and for moving like a legal pit bull when clients were in danger. "Get me a restraining order ready and stand by," I said, voice steady. "I need evidence. I need paperwork. I need someone who will file while I breathe." She responded with professional calm and a list of steps to start immediately. I moved methodically because chaos is the enemy of justice. First, I photographed Emmy's arms and legs, the faint red impressions where cold had stung her skin and where a hand had left a mark. Close-ups, wide shots, multiple angles, timestamps on metadata because details matter later in courtrooms where stories are often measured by pixels and clarity. Emmy watched me and wrote slowly in the margin of her notebook. "I was scared, but you came," and the pencil stroke beneath those words trembled with a small force that punched me deeper than any shouted accusation. I uploaded the images to a secure cloud folder and emailed copies to Melissa, so nothing could be lost if the phone vanished. Next, I seized the tactical advantage of surveillance where it existed. During our last hour in the house, my training had spotted cameras tucked into corners like sleeping wolves, and I knew how to extract footage without alerting whoever had planted them. David, when he arrived, used a handheld device to clone the Wi-Fi network signal and pull raw files off the router while I stood guard with Emmy pressed to my side. We duplicated file sets to multiple thumb drives and encrypted them with a passphrase only Melissa and I shared. Evidence that someone had filmed a child being pushed into snow is pure gold in a legal strategy. It turns abstract cruelty into documentable endangerment. Then, medical documentation. I drove Emmy to the nearest emergency room with lights hunting the dark and waited in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and tired compassion. Doctors are bureaucrats of care, and they write what they see without sentiment, which is crucial because sentiment is expensive in court. The ER nurse examined Emmy with gentle hands, practiced on fragile bodies, took photographs, recorded her vitals, and noted the exposure details in the chart. Hypothermia risk observed superficial reddening, consistent with cold exposure and elevated anxiety levels. I answered their questions in precise phrases, avoiding embellishment because truth is a thin, clean blade that cuts through contrived narratives. I asked for copies of all records immediately and requested that they be expedited. Melissa later told me hospital timestamps are often the best way to prove an event occurred when disputes about timing arise. While the ER was processing its paperwork, I called Child Protective Services and filed a report. The social worker on the line was professional direct, and she asked the right questions. Has the child been injured? Is she safe now? Who else knows? I gave names, times, the motel location, and explained that I intended to pursue legal action. Filing the CPS report was not an act of vindictiveness. It was a necessary lever in a system that sometimes moves too slowly without a formal referral. I made sure the CPS file included the surveillance evidence and the ER documentation. It creates a chain that is hard to ignore. Throughout the night, David and Melissa coordinated in real time, building a paper trail that would be difficult to twist. David called in a favor with a local forensic tech to hash the camera footage and verify metadata so no one could later claim the videos were doctored. Melissa drafted the temporary restraining order and a formal complaint for child endangerment, and explained how we would proceed to ensure safety and custody measures were immediate. I slept little that night, and when I did fall into a jagged nap, it was with one hand on Emmy's knee and a legal checklist looping in my head like a mantra. In the morning, we moved to the next phase, notifying the authorities with the assembled package. I walked into the county sheriff's office carrying a folder heavy with evidence-printed photos, thumb drives of video ER records, my written account, and the CPS report number. An officer took the file, his expression a mix of professional courtesy and unspoken alarm. Departments hate surprises when they are about to get large, messy ones. Melissa filed our emergency motion and served the papers electronically to Gerald and my mother, an action that would make their home a legal zone where certain behaviors could not occur without consequence. I watched Emmy as the legal machine started to turn her small face pale but steadier. The words she had written the night before, a quiet proof that I had done the right thing. I was scared, but you came. I thought the hard part was making it out of that house with Emmy in my arms, but gathering proof and building a network of people willing to stand with us proved to be a different kind of battle. When you move from instinct into strategy, you trade emotion for process, and process is where justice finds a home. David arrived before dawn, a duffel slung over his shoulder and a calm that comes from decades of following orders. We did not waste words. I laid out what I had: the ER paperwork, the CPS report, the handful of photos I had taken, and the notes Emmy had written in the margin of her notebook. He nodded and set to work. The first video clip we recovered was small, only 20 seconds long, but what it captured was unmistakable. A child pushed backward down the steps into snow, the back door closing like a controlled mechanism, while voices in the background laughed softly as if cruelty were entertainment. The metadata showed timestamps that matched my phone logs and the ER intake time. Another clip showed Gerald standing in the hallway watching Emmy with a passive expression while my mother adjusted a throw pillow like she was tidying a set. We compiled the files into a locked folder, copied them to 3 separate drives, and uploaded redacted stills to a secure cloud server for Melissa to preview. We added a written narrative anchored to the evidence date time, weather conditions, witness positions, and the chain of custody for the electronics. The chain of custody would become crucial because defense teams often try to discredit digital evidence by claiming tampering, so we included affidavits from the forensic tech who hashed the files and a signed statement from David describing how the drives were copied and stored. Speaking of witnesses, Mrs. Miller delivered more than she expected. A neighbor for decades and the kind of woman who knows every cough and odd shadow on our street, she approached me quietly at the county coffee shop where I had gone to print copies for the DA. She folded her hands like someone carrying a secret and said in a voice small with relief, "I always feared this day." Her statement was blunt and raw and exactly the kind of human testimony prosecutors love, because it shows pattern and community knowledge rather than a single isolated accusation. We sat in that coffee shop while she described details she had never told anyone before seeing me with Emmy at the bus stop that winter. When the child had sat apart from family pictures, she had heard Gerald shout at the house late one night, a muffled sound she had assumed was private, but that later sat in her gut like a wrongness. Her account was precise and steady, like someone who had lived long enough to name what she feared. We collected statements from other neighbors who remembered small incidents: an evening where Emmy had been left in the car briefly in spring, a school pickup where Gerald had scolded her publicly until she withdrew into silence, a church event where my mother shushed Emmy and then laughed about it with friends. Those statements painted a picture of repetition rather than a single failing. Melissa told me later that prosecutors are less interested in the sensational and more interested in the habitual. Habit builds pattern, and pattern gives juries confidence that what they are hearing is not a one-off or a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Melissa prepared the legal scaffolding. She worked with the DA liaison to frame our complaint as felony child endangerment, rather than a simple domestic dispute. That matters because the criminal threshold for felony charges requires proof that the child's risk was significant and that the defendant acted recklessly or willfully. The surveillance footage and the hospital record gave us that. Melissa also prepared an emergency motion for custody, arguing that Emmy's continued presence in the house created an imminent risk and that immediate protective orders were necessary. She drafted subpoenas for the raw footage and arranged for a child forensic interviewer to be present if Emmy could be questioned in a controlled environment. She knew how to layer evidence so that each part buttressed the others. David worked the human terrain. He interviewed a former contractor who had worked on our house and who admitted to seeing the cameras installed in specific places at Gerald's direction. The contractor said Gerald insisted on full visibility of family areas and described the camera placement as unusual for a household, more like a private security setup than a family monitoring system. That testimony undermined claims the cameras were for safety. It showed intent to surveil family members, not to protect them, and intent matters in court because it suggests motive. One of the most harrowing moments came when David called to say he had found 3 separate logs showing Gerald locking the back door with a code at times that matched Emmy's absence from the house, not the times Gerald reported as family activity. The logs matched the surveillance clips. The pattern was explicit: 3 incidents where Gerald intentionally left Emmy exposed in the cold for a period long enough to create risk and for which he provided a nonchalant explanation when pressed. Melissa marked those dates in her brief as part of the timeline that established reckless endangerment. We also documented direct threats toward me. There was a voicemail Gerald had left when he suspected I might leave earlier, thin with anger, where he warned me not to take his family apart and said consequences for causing trouble could be severe. Threats directed at a parent in the context of child endangerment often escalate the prosecutorial view of danger because they demonstrate motive to control rather than to protect. As all this moved forward, we made sure to shield Emmy from the media and from unnecessary exposure. Privacy concerns are real in these cases, and the last thing a child needs is to be the subject of public spectacle while a legal fight plays out. Melissa filed protective motions requesting sealed records and limited access to video evidence until the DA approved public release. The world outside could wait. Emmy's safety could not. Meanwhile, we squeezed more data out of what Gerald had left behind by accident. He had kept a poorly secured guest Wi-Fi network with a password so obvious it read like a joke. David used his access to clone the router backup legitimately, given that Linda had left the network open during a family luncheon, and the contractor had told us that network backed up local devices automatically. Using that access, David pulled archived footage that Gerald likely thought had been stored off-site. The backups included files of late-night footage where Gerald coached my mother on how to respond if Emmy cried and where he timed entries to the back door. Those files were raw and unedited. Each clip made the behavioral pattern clearer. Melissa worked with a forensic analyst who hashed the files and prepared a certification of authenticity to counter any future claims of manipulation. By the time the DA's office had the packet, it was exhaustive raw footage, hashed files, hospital records, neighbor statements, contractor testimony, David's access logs, and a clear legal argument for felony charges. We had turned a night of terror into a dossier heavy enough to move bureaucracies. Building an alliance is part tactical and part social. You need people who understand evidence, people who can authenticate it, and people who will stand in court and say this is what they saw. In the rooms where juries weigh truth, allies tip the scale. Melissa crafted subpoenas and lined up expert witnesses, a child psychologist who would explain the trauma silent condition, and an emergency responder who would testify about hypothermia risks in that storm. She also worked with the family services coordinator to create a safety plan should Gerald attempt to contact us. The day a DA investigator called and said they would present the case to a grand jury was the first real time I allowed myself to breathe. The work had only just begun, truly. I sat on the motel bed with Emmy's small hand in mine, the cheap lamp making the snow outside look like another country. We had set the basic safety pieces in motion: ER records, filed CPS report, logged evidence copied and encrypted. The legal and security people were moving, but there is a quiet after a storm that feels louder than alarms. In that quiet, you hear the tiny things you once pretended not to hear, and they are louder because there is nothing to drown them out. We practiced small signs that night. The immediate danger sign was 2 taps on the wrist and a slide of the thumb like closing a book. The sign for scared was 2 fingers crossed over the chest. The help sign was a flat hand pressed to the knee, then slid toward the ground. Emmy learned them like she was rehearsing lines. We repeated them until the motions were reflex. Repetition gave her a measure of control and made the signals a language we could trust under pressure. Gerald's name buzzed my phone more often than I wanted. Voicemails arrived in a pattern: calm, voice, thin menace, the same coercive insistence. Bring her back. You need to learn your place. He framed possession as protection and used language that made ownership sound like care. Linda texted in that brittle, performative way she always did. You embarrassed us. Family is family. Melissa advised, forwarding every message and saving screenshots. That discipline felt cold in the moment, but documentation turns coercion into evidence. Without it, those words fade into whispers. Between messages, I had Emmy rehearse scenarios. If someone knocked at the motel door, she was to tap her wrist twice and curl into the corner of the bed, hands over her notebook. If a car idled outside, she would slide her hand along her sleeve and pull her blanket closer, then write the time in her book on the inside cover. These small rituals gave her tiny outcomes she could control, and control makes fear manageable. A child feels small when adults argue about them. We tried to return the power of small practical acts. I mapped the likely moves Gerald might make and prepared counters. He could try to manipulate the police with a contrived call. He could present himself as the reasonable adult at church and persuade acquaintances to vouch for him. He could try to use custody claims as a weapon by framing my actions as abduction. So, we layered deterrence. David arranged for discreet patrol checks near the motel and had an off-duty friend run vehicle sweeps at random hours. Melissa filed emergency motions that demanded Gerald surrender any devices that contained surveillance footage pending subpoena, and that requested no contact orders. We built layers of deterrence designed to blunt any impulsive escalation and to convert threats into documented behavior. We worked the human terrain. Mrs. Miller had already stepped forward, but courage can be contagious when treated with care. I called other neighbors, gently explained what we needed, and listened. Their accounts filled in small but telling details, incidents that looked harmless separately, but together formed a pattern. One neighbor recalled seeing Emmy shivering on the front step one spring afternoon while Gerald smoked by the garage. Another remembered Gerald publicly scolding Emmy at a block barbecue until she retreated inside the house. Those harmless-seeming fragments, when placed in sequence, no longer looked like isolated lapses. Melissa formalized the evidence into a legal architecture. She subpoenaed raw footage, lined up a forensic analyst to hash files, and scheduled a child psychologist to testify about trauma-related mutism and how repeated humiliation and fear can silence a child. She emphasized chain of custody. Raw footage must be proven untampered. She arranged for a child forensic interviewer who would ask non-leading questions if necessary, because a child's statement must be preserved delicately. A methodical record is the opposite of sensationalism. It is what persuades judges and juries. Throughout the day, Emmy practiced sign language and wrote in her notebook. Her small hand betrayed the muscle memory of shock, the way fingers tighten suddenly when fear arrives. I taught her to be precise. Signs are triggers for specific responses. A 2-tap wrist signal brings immediate physical protection. A slide of the palm toward the floor summons law enforcement contact through Melissa's office. The clarity protects the child from overreaction and ensures legal and security responses are proportionate and timely. Tension increased in increments. Gerald's voicemails slid from coercive to venomous. "You will bring shame," he said in one message, the words like spent shrapnel. Linda oscillated between pleading and blaming. She sent a message begging for family unity 1 hour and castigating me the next. Each communication was saved with a metadata timestamp and forwarded to Melissa. Evidence is patient. It waits while tempers flare, and then it shows the truth. One afternoon, I noticed a white SUV idling near the motel, and David saw it too. He stepped out with a coffee and asked the driver a casual question while I watched from the window. The vehicle drifted away, but the moment was a reminder that the situation was live and that people we could not see were willing to test boundaries. David called an off-duty acquaintance to sweep the area on odd hours, a low-cost deterrent that projected presence. Presence is part legal work and part psychology. When you are not isolated, potential aggressors hesitate. The day before the hearing, we rehearsed. Melissa wanted the evidence presented in a precise order and asked me to limit public commentary. The goal was to make the record methodical, not theatrical. Emmy would not be put on the stand unnecessarily. A forensic interview would be used to preserve her statements. I explained to Emmy that making the pattern visible in court could stop the repeat. She nodded and wrote, "I trust you, Mom." Those 3 words were simple and powerful and steadied us. At night, I watched her sleep and allowed myself a guarded calm. Organizing panic into protocol is strange. Calm becomes an instrument rather than a feeling. We had allies in place, evidence cataloged, and a quiet code between us. The storm had passed, but its echo remained. The quiet had been transformed into an engine that could move law, community, and consequence. I wrote a short plan on a napkin and left copies with Melissa and David evidence order witness list emergency contacts and an exit protocol if Gerald tried to force an encounter. It felt ritualistic to reduce a child's danger to checkboxes, but rituals help when emotions would otherwise erode judgment. I also put together a small pack for Emmy: extra blankets, a thermos, a spare set of mittens, and a laminated copy of her signs, so anyone who had to help would know what to do. Before dawn on the hearing day, I kissed Emmy's forehead and promised that no one would hurt her. Family court in Jefferson County does not look dramatic like movies promise. It looks ordinary with beige walls and fluorescent lights that hum like tired sentinels. Courtrooms are not arenas of spectacle. They are rooms where truth competes with denial and documentation wins over volume. I walked in holding Emmy's hand, her notebook tucked under her arm, her small mittens dangling from her wrist like soft armor. David stood behind us like a silent column steady as concrete, and Melissa walked with her folder pressed close, her expression crisp and calm. Gerald arrived in a navy suit too sharp for sincerity. Chin-lifted tie, nodded like someone decorated himself for admiration, not accountability. His lawyer carried a briefcase that looked like it had been bought for appearances, the kind you purchase when you believe confidence can substitute for preparation. Linda wore pearls and sadness, performing grief like a part she had rehearsed in her mirror, clutching a handkerchief with trembling fingers that never quite touched her eyes. We sat and waited while the clerk called the case. Gerald kept glancing around, expecting affirmation. Men like him rely on public perception on believing the world will applaud the costume they put on. When Judge Whitmore entered the room, stilled. His presence was not stern, but grounded the quiet weight of experience. He adjusted his glasses, read the docket, then lifted his gaze. Melissa stood first. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady as steel wrapped in velvet, "we are presenting a petition for emergency protective custody, a restraining order, and referral for felony child endangerment." Gerald's lawyer rose, puffed his chest, and said with false ease, "This is all a misunderstanding, Your Honor." A family disagreement exaggerated in the heat of emotion. Linda's handkerchief fluttered like a dove trained to appear fragile. "She always exaggerates." She whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear her voice, trembling in practiced indignation. The judge nodded without reaction, then looked at me. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you have evidence?" The question cut clear through the room. It was not dramatic, just procedural, but to me it felt like a door unlocked. Melissa did not speak. Instead, she pressed play on the first clip. The screen flickered, then showed the house snow swirling outside the glass. In silence, the footage displayed a small child nudged into a winter storm, the door closing the stillness after. No crying, no screaming. Just a child bracing against life she did not deserve. A gasp rippled across the courtroom like wind. Not dramatic, just raw. Another video followed. Gerald's voice calm and chilling. "She needs discipline." My mother appearing behind him, adjusting a blanket like nothing was wrong. Gerald closing the door again. The room held its breath. The judge leaned forward slightly. Not shock, but focus. He watched every pixel like a witness to truth buried too long. Then Melissa played the final clip, the one where my voice spoke cold and controlled. "Touch her again, and I will bring the law to your doorstep." A murmur rolled through the benches. Gerald stiffened his lawyer, suddenly very still. Linda's shoulders collapsed by inches, her mask slipping as she realized pretense could not fight footage. The judge asked gently, "Ms. Mitchell, did your daughter attempt to cry for help?" Emmy lifted her hand, not shaking now, and made the help sign we practiced. One hand pressed to the knee, then down. Simple. Strong. The room froze. Even the air felt suspended. The judge watched her with careful respect. Not pity, and nodded once. "I see," he said softly. Gerald leaped from his chair, face blotched red, voice cutting through the courtroom in a shout that tried to mask panic as anger. "She is manipulating you. She is weak. This is all." He did not finish. Two bailiffs moved in swift silence and pressed him back into his seat. Firm hands gripping his arms. His breath came in short bursts, the control he worshipped shattered in public. People who rely on intimidation falter when eyes witness them. Linda stood too, voice breaking not with sorrow but outrage. "We were only trying to help her grow strong. Children should obey. She needs structure." Raina always made things dramatic. She left home to avoid responsibility. "That is enough," the judge said, not loudly but with authority that silences storms. Linda sat shaking her pearls, suddenly looking like chains. The judge typed for a long moment, then spoke with measured gravity. "The evidence demonstrates a clear and immediate danger to the child. Temporary full custody to Mrs. Mitchell. A restraining order against Mr. Kane effective immediately. Referral to District Attorney for felony child endangerment." He paused, eyes piercing both Gerald and Linda. "This court does not confuse control with care." A whisper spread across the gallery. Some nodded. Some looked stunned. The system had drawn a line and placed them on the losing side. Emmy squeezed my hand. Her fingers were warm and steady. Gerald surged again, voice breaking not with remorse but desperation. "She thinks she can take everything I will not." He did not get further. The bailiffs held him and his lawyer whispered harshly for him to stop. It was too late. The mask was gone. Linda turned to me with trembling disbelief, like she had been betrayed by the world she thought she controlled. "How could you do this to us?" she whispered. I met her gaze quiet as snowfall. "You did it to yourselves." The judge dismissed us. Chairs scraped, papers rustled, but the silence that followed us out felt heavy with truth. People looked at me the way soldiers look at the one who pulled them out under fire. Quiet respect, recognition, not of perfection, but survival and action. Emmy walked beside me, boots tapping small rhythms of freedom. Outside, snow drifted softly gentle compared to the storm we endured. David opened the door for us, no words needed. Melissa nodded once satisfied but vigilant. Justice is not a moment, it is a process, but this was one moment where truth had a voice, even if mine trembled, and Emmy's remained silent. We stepped into the cold and the world felt clearer. I had not just taken my daughter out of danger. I had exposed danger to daylight, and once seen daylight never forgets. 2 weeks passed, and the snow outside our townhouse had begun to soften at the edges, not melting, just easing like the world was learning to breathe again. Emmy and I settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Therapy sessions twice a week, warm meals she helped stir, quiet mornings where she sat by the window with her blanket and her notebook, drawing small birds and writing single soft words beneath them like hope, safe, warm. I kept routine's tight structure familiar because rebuilding trust is not done through speeches but through repetition. Stability is a language, and I spoke it with each predictable morning. And then the phone rang, a blocked number. A breath on the line first, grainy like someone who had smoked anger instead of cigarettes. Then, his voice rough around the edges now, desperation seeping into the spaces where arrogance used to live. "They'll put me away," Gerald rasped. "Tell the judge I'm sick. I didn't mean harm. I was teaching. You know discipline matters. You know the world is cruel. Tell them." The silence after his plea was strange, almost hollow, like he was stunned I had not interrupted to comfort or negotiate. Before I could speak, he added lower pleading from a place I had never heard him go. You don't want to destroy me. This has gone too far. Fix this." His words revealed the truth beneath everything he never believed consequences were meant for him. In his world, punishment was something he delivered, not received. "You hurt her," I said finally, voice quiet flat. "And you believed it was your right." He inhaled sharply, and for a second I heard panic behind the mask. "I was trying to—" I ended the call before the excuse could form. A pattern must be broken by refusal, not debate. Hours later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Linda. Her voice cracked like ice under weight. "We're family," she said as if the word were a shield. "Help us." I almost admired the revision. Suddenly, the weak mother she once dismissed was not too soft but powerful enough to rescue them. She whispered accusations wrapped in sorrow, then guilt dressed as obligation. "Do you know what people are saying? Do you know what this is doing to us? A child misunderstanding, and now we are ruined. Everyone thinks we are monsters. Fix it. Please." The strange thing about people who enable cruelty is that they expect forgiveness not because they earned it, but because they believe they are entitled to it. "Family protects children," I answered. "You failed." There was a small break in her voice, like a spine bending under truth. "You are ungrateful," she hissed, and the old familiar tone returned bitter and sharp. Gratitude to her meant obedience. I hung up. Protection is not cruelty. Boundaries are not betrayal. Loving a child is not optional. A week passed. Emmy practiced writing sentences and warming her voice with soft humming exercises from her speech therapist, the sound delicate like a feather brushing glass. She laughed once silent shoulders shaking, and I memorized the sight. Stability was growing roots. Then, on a quiet Wednesday morning, a knock rattled the front door. Not the gentle knock of neighbors. The heavy, insistent knock of someone convinced they still had a claim. I moved Emmy behind me and signaled her to go to the hallway corner. She followed without hesitation, small feet soft on the wood floor notebook pressed to her chest. David stood by the window instantly, hand near his jacket, where his badge and authority lived, even off duty. I approached the door but did not open it. Through the peephole, I saw him. Gerald. No suit, no polished facade. Coat unbuttoned hair, unkempt desperation sitting on him like frost. His breath clouded in the air. "Raina," he called, voice strained. "Let me in. We need to talk. I can explain. You don't understand what you've done." I did not answer at first. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is judgment. He knocked again, harder. "Open the door." His demand cracked on the last word. I unlocked the security latch but kept the door closed, my voice level as I spoke through it. "You are violating a restraining order. I just need to talk," he insisted, voice pitching between plea and command. "People like him do not come to apologize. They come to reclaim control. One step closer, and it's trespassing." I said calm, steady, "and I know the law better than you." David stepped forward, then posture ready, authority quiet but unmistakable. Gerald jolted, startled by his presence. "You can't hide behind them," he sputtered. "She needs structure. You're ruining her. You think courts know better than family." "The court knows better than you," I answered. His eyes flicked with anger. "You always were dramatic, running to outsiders instead of solving things inside the family." And there it was again, the belief that secrecy equals strength, that silence equals loyalty. "You left her in the snow," I reminded him, each word a verdict. He flinched, like he had not expected blunt truth. "That wasn't you, you twisted it." His stammer faltered into a dry laugh, brittle and frantic. "Fine. If you won't listen, you'll regret." Before he could finish, blue lights flickered down the street. Police cars rolled up quietly but decisively. Melissa had filed alert orders. Any violation triggered immediate response. 2 officers approached. "Sir, you're violating a protective order," one said. "You need to step back." Gerald stiffened. "This is ridiculous. She is destroying our family." "Sir!" The officer repeated, voice firm. "Turn around." Gerald resisted for a heartbeat too long, then sagged as though shock weighed on his bones. His wrists were cuffed without drama. There was no dignity left to salvage. His face sagged, not in regret, but in disbelief. Linda arrived seconds later, breathless, having followed him in her car. She rushed forward, but the officers blocked her. Her voice cracked with outrage and bewilderment. "How dare you do this to your own parents? We raised you. We gave you everything." I stood inside the doorway with the lock still engaged and replied calmly, "You gave me fear. You tried to give it to my child." "Ungrateful," she hissed, shaking. "Cold. Heartless." Emmy appeared beside me, then notebook in hand. She held it up to the small window in the door. 4 words were written steady and clean. "I heard everything. I remember." Linda recoiled as though struck. Not physically, but by truth, which is an injury pride cannot disguise. The officers led Gerald to the car. Linda stood alone in the snow, her certainty collapsing, her outrage freezing into quiet shock. Sometimes consequences do not roar. Sometimes they simply arrive. As the police car pulled away, Emmy leaned her head into my arm. Her body relaxed just a fraction, but enough to feel like dawn breaking. I locked the door gently and whispered the promise I had made weeks before. Never again. The days after Gerald's arrest unfolded slowly like winter sunlight stretching across frost. Justice does not rush. It moves with the steady patience of something that knows it cannot be stopped once the wheels turn. The district attorney called first voice formal, confirming charges of felony child endangerment and harassment. Hearing the words spoken aloud felt heavy, not triumphant, like a verdict not just on his actions, but on every unseen moment that led to that night. Legal terms carry weight because they turn harm into record. I wrote the date and the case number in a notebook not to remember what they did, but to honor what Emmy endured. Linda did not appear at the courthouse for the arraignment, but word traveled fast in small northern towns. Places like ours trade news faster than snow blows across a windshield. Whispers turned into stares. The church congregation that once praised her composure now avoided her in the grocery store aisle. Some turned away politely. Others abruptly pretended to study canned soup labels. Community respect once her shield dissolved. She called twice more short-clipped messages where shame wrestled bitterness. Neither apology nor threat, just a woman who could not understand how the world she curated so carefully could crumble. She stopped calling when she realized silence from me was not an invitation, but a choice. Church friends once her audience began visiting each other without her. A woman from her Bible group reportedly told someone at the salon, "If you can watch harm and say nothing, maybe God steps back from you too." I did not rejoice in her isolation, but there was symmetry in seeing a life built on image collapse when truth arrived. Meanwhile, Mrs. Miller knocked on my door one bright morning when the snow sparkled like 1,000 small promises. She held a warm loaf of banana bread wrapped in a tea towel, her voice trembling when she said thank you for saving that little girl. I started to answer, but she shook her head, eyes soft. "No," she whispered. "Sometimes one person has to do what everyone else fears." I invited her in for tea, and we sat at my small kitchen table while Emmy drew birds in her notebook. Mrs. Miller told me she had feared saying anything for years, afraid she would be dismissed or targeted. Sometimes silence is not cruelty, but paralysis. Courage is not always loud. That afternoon felt like sunlight through frosted glass. Even small kindness has weight. Emmy began speech therapy twice a week, a room filled with soft toys and warm tones where a gentle therapist helped her find voice through breath exercises and humming patterns. Some children recover speech, suddenly, others slowly. Progress is not measured by noise, but by safety. One afternoon, she whispered a faint hum, a small vibration against my shoulder, and it carried more power than a shout. We celebrated quietly with chocolate chip pancakes. Healing can taste like warmth. I enrolled her in art therapy as well, and she painted birds' houses and once a door with light spilling beneath it. The therapist said children draw safety before they speak it. I pinned that drawing to our refrigerator like a medal. I joined a local support circle for domestic abuse survivors, specifically a group that included veterans and mothers. We sat in a community center room with plastic chairs and lukewarm coffee, but the stories shared there felt sacred. Women who once stood in uniform now sat holding toddlers speaking quietly about harm they once feared to name. They welcomed me without judgment, no praise, no pity, just recognition. Broken places still hold strength, someone said, and the room hummed with quiet agreement. I shared my story not in dramatic detail, but in facts. He locked her outside, I documented. I left, I took action. The women nodded. Some tears fell. A few hands squeezed mine. They understood that justice is a long road, not a single courtroom moment. The legal process continued slowly. Hearings scheduled dates, set mandatory evaluations ordered. The restraining order stayed in place like a steel boundary. Melissa visited to go over next steps, victims advocacy coordination, compensation paperwork, and a continued safety plan. She reminded me to document everything even now. Abusers sometimes test boundaries when reality sets in. My phone remained on silent mode with emergency alert exceptions. I taught Emmy how to press the emergency call button if she ever needed help. She practiced with the calm seriousness of a child who knows safety is something you learn. At the grocery store, a woman approached quietly, voice gentle. You did the right thing. It was not loud support, not a crowd cheering, but the quiet nod of an older woman who understood how hard leaving can be. These small acknowledgments accumulate. They still matter. There were awkward encounters too. One afternoon at the library, I overheard two people whispering the kind of half-gossip where shock fights discomfort. Is it really that bad? One murmured. The other replied, pictures don't lie. I did not interrupt. Truth does not need me to argue. It stands. At night, when Emmy slept curled under her fox blanket, I sometimes sat awake and watched snow fall through the streetlight glow. Quiet can feel eerie after chaos, but it can also feel earned. I journaled then not about anger, but about boundaries, protection, rebuilding. Healing is not an erasure, it is a cultivation. In therapy, Emmy began writing short sentences. Today warm, mom safe, snow pretty. One day she wrote, I am okay. I traced the words with my finger like prayer. She also wrote, once I remember snow, but I am inside now. I kissed the top of her head and whispered, you will always be inside now. We practiced whisper sounds, humming tones, soft syllables like and ah. No pressure, just gentle welcome. Sound is not the only form of speech. One evening, I attended a veterans meeting. Someone there recognized my last name and paused before approaching. You're the one from the court case, he said. Good job. It was not flattery, just acknowledgement. Military people understand protection. They understand following through when you see harm. Justice is heavy but honorable work. I did not return to my mother's house. I did not answer Linda's final voicemail where her voice sounded smaller, defeated, but still unable to say sorry. She ended with, you could have talked to us, but violence disguised as discipline is not misunderstanding. Silence is not miscommunication. I owed them nothing, not explanation, not reconciliation. But I did not hate them. Hate is just another tether. I chose release instead. Emmy's world expanded. She painted in art class, made a friend named Chloe, and showed her how to sign safe and thank you. Watching her teach another child a sign meant healing was not only repair, it was inheritance. Love passed forward. When spring approached and the frost loosened its hold on branches, Mrs. Miller brought over daffodils and tucked a note under the vase, survivors build gardens where walls once stood. I placed it on the mantel. Life did not return to what it was before. It returned to what it should have always been. Safe, steady, ours. If you were Raina, would you have forgiven them? Tell me below. 1 year later, Christmas lights blinked gently across our small living room, casting warm gold against the window where snow drifted in slow, soft patterns, peaceful instead of threatening. Emmy sat beside me on the couch, wrapped in her fox blanket, tapping rhythm to a holiday cartoon song with her pencil on her notebook, a habit that always made me smile because it meant her world no longer felt silent, even if her voice had not fully returned. Outside, Fort Drum lay quiet, the kind of stillness winter grants when storms are over and the air feels like a held breath. I poured hot cocoa for both of us, extra marshmallows for her, because she always counted them like little clouds, and for a moment I thought back to a year earlier when snow meant fear and doors meant danger. Now the door was locked not to keep her out, but to keep her safe. Safety is a practice. Healing is a series of small breaths. Love I had learned is vigilance and softness intertwined. Emmy slid her notebook toward me and wrote, "Christmas warm," then drew a tiny heart. I touched her hair gentle, and she leaned into my shoulder in that quiet, trusting way she had developed only recently, as though the world had finally earned her softness back. Then she looked up at me, eyes steady, and parted her lips. A small sound, fragile but real, formed in the space between us. Mom. Not loud, not strong, just one fragile syllable rising like dawn after the longest night. My breath caught, and tears came quietly, not in sobs, but in steady warmth down my cheeks, the way gratitude sometimes arrives without permission. I held her face gently and whispered back, "I hear you, sweetheart. I am right here." She smiled, small and proud, like she had just lifted a mountain with one word. Outside, snowflakes continued falling, but they did not stir fear. They fell like feathers, soft, harmless part of a world that now belonged to us again. I watched them and thought about obedience, about silence, about the ways control tries to dress itself as love. Obedience is not strength. Silence is not peace. Strength is choosing to break cycles even when your voice shakes. Peace is teaching a child that home is not earned through pain, but given through protection. The house felt warm in a way I once feared was impossible, like walls could learn new memories if given enough time and truth. In the quiet, Emmy tapped my arm and pointed toward the window fogged with warmth. She climbed down from the couch, small feet padding across the floor, and pressed her hand to the cold glass. I followed and stood beside her as she traced letters slowly with her fingertip into the condensation. Free. The word shimmered faintly, edges glowing against winter outside. When she stepped back, I gently placed my fingertip beside hers and added another word beneath it. Forever. She read it, then pressed her palm to my chest, not for comfort, but connection, as though to say, "We did this, we built this, we are safe here." Light from the Christmas tree reflected in the window, merging our silhouettes with the glow, mother and daughter inside warmth, while winter stayed where it belonged, outside, powerless. I exhaled long and easy and felt for the first time that survival had finally turned into living. And in that quiet holiday morning, with snow falling like grace and my daughter whispering the word that tethered us back to hope, I knew that the world had not beaten us. We had carved out a space where fear had no voice and love had many.